The summer of 1453 didn't end with conquest. It ended with selection. When Constantinople finally fell after 53 days of cannon fire and burning oil, the Ottoman forces didn't just breach the walls. They catalogued what remained inside, street by street, house by house, body by body. And among the rubble and smoke, they found something the Sultan valued more than gold or relics. They found the daughters of Byzantium. These weren't women of the court or the noble houses, though those would come later. These were the daughters of merchants, of scribes, of candle makers and barrel makers, girls who had spent the siege, huddled in cellars with their mothers, praying to icons that couldn't stop what was coming. When the soldiers dragged them into the light, their faces were still streaked with ash. Their hands still clutched rosaries that would be torn away within the hour. The orders were explicit. The Sultan had issued a decree before the final assault, one that survives in Ottoman military records kept in the Topkapi archives. Young women of Christian faith, unmarried, were to be separated from the general population and brought to holding areas near the hippodrome. The scribes who recorded this called it mercy. They claimed the Sultan was sparing these girls from the chaos of conquest, offering them protection under imperial authority. But protection meant something very different when your protector owned you. By nightfall on May 29th, over 300 girls had been gathered in a converted cistern beneath what had once been the Forum of Constantine. The space was cool and dark, lit only by torches that turned their white shifts into flickering ghosts. Guards stood at every entrance, not to keep invaders out, to keep the girls in. They weren't prisoners of war, they were inventory. If you've ever wondered what happened to the innocent in history's darkest hours, what the official records never quite say, then stay with this. Because what follows isn't legend or rumour. It's documented in ledgers, in letters, in the horrified accounts of those who witnessed and survived. And if this story grips you the way it should, if it makes you feel something the history books never did, then subscribe. Because there are more of these stories, thousands of them, buried in archives that most people will never see. Now back to the cistern. The girls were told to stand in lines. Ottoman officials moved between them with oil lamps, lifting chins, checking teeth, examining hands for calluses that might indicate useful labour. It was a market inspection without the pretense of a market. There was no buying here, only taking. And what they were selecting for wasn't strength or skill, it was something far more specific. One girl, whose name appears in a Venetian merchant's letter as Theodora, was 14. She had spent the siege caring for her younger brothers while her father manned the walls. When the city fell, her father didn't come home. Her mother had hidden her in a barrel in their cellar, covering her with salted fish to mask her scent from the soldiers who were going door to door. It worked for 3 days. On the 4th day, a different kind of soldier arrived. Not the irregular troops looking for plunder, but official forces with lists and orders. They pulled her from the barrel. They didn't hurt her. Not then. They simply added her name to a ledger and told her to walk. When she asked where her mother was, they didn't answer. When she asked where they were taking her, they smiled in a way that made her stop asking questions. The selection process took 2 full days. By the end, the girls had been divided into groups. Some were marked for domestic service in the palace, others for redistribution to military commanders as rewards for valour during the siege. But there was a third group, smaller, younger. These girls were marked with a different symbol in the ledgers, a crescent and star that indicated they belonged to the imperial household directly. Theodora was in this group. What made a girl valuable enough for this distinction? The records are clinically clear. Age between 12 and 16. unblemished skin, no visible deformities. And most critically, verification of virginity. This last requirement was checked by female attendants brought specifically for this purpose, women who had served in the Sultan's household and knew exactly what they were looking for. The examinations were conducted behind curtains in the cistern, quickly and without ceremony. Those who passed were marked. Those who didn't were sent to the second group. The French chronicler Nicolas Barbaro, who survived the siege and documented its aftermath, wrote that the sounds coming from that cistern were worse than the sounds of battle. Not screams, he noted, but weeping. Constant, exhausted weeping that echoed off the ancient stones like a funeral hymn that wouldn't end. By the third day, the selected girls were moved. They were taken in covered wagons to the old Boukoleon Palace on the shore of the Marmara Sea, where the imperial harem was being expanded to accommodate the Sultan's new capital. The journey was short, less than a mile, but it crossed an unbridgeable distance. On one side of that ride, they were daughters of Constantinople. On the other, they belonged to the empire that had killed their city. The palace they entered was in transition. Byzantine mosaics still covered the walls, images of Christ and the Virgin Mary watching, as Ottoman workers installed new fountains and divans. The girls were brought to a wing that had once housed the Empress's attendants. Now it would house something else, entirely. A training ground, a waiting room, a place where Christian daughters would be transformed into something their mothers wouldn't recognise. They were stripped of their clothing first. The shifts and dresses they'd worn through the siege were burned in a courtyard brazier. They watched them turn to ash and smoke, the last physical connection to the lives they'd known. Then they were bathed, not gently, efficiently. Their hair was washed with oils that smelled of roses and almonds, scents so foreign they made some of the girls vomit. Their skin was scrubbed until it reddened. Their nails were trimmed and cleaned. When they emerged, they were dressed in silk, light fabric in colours they'd never been allowed to wear. Emerald green, deep purple, scarlet red, the kind of colours that in Byzantium had been reserved for the imperial family. Now they marked a different kind of ownership. That first night in the palace, they were fed. Rich food, more than any of them had seen in months. Roasted lamb with honey, flatbread still warm from the oven, dates and figs and nuts. It was a kind of meal that should have brought relief after weeks of near starvation during the siege. Instead, it brought dread. Because they all understood what they were being fattened for. Theodora, sitting on silk cushions in a room lined with carved wooden screens, asked one of the attendants when they would be allowed to go home. The woman, a Greek convert who had served in the harem for years, looked at her with something between pity and contempt. "This is your home now," she said. "The sooner you accept that, the easier it becomes." But it never became easy. The training began the next morning. Though training is too gentle a word for what they endured, it was erasure disguised as education. The transformation of identity through systematic dismantling of everything they had been taught to believe about themselves, about God, about the world. They woke before dawn to the sound of a brass bell, not the church bells they had known all their lives, but something sharper, more insistent. The attendants, all women who had themselves once been Christian captives, moved through the rooms pulling back silk curtains and pulling the girls from their sleeping mats. There was no gradual waking, no moment of forgetting where they were. Every morning began with the immediate, crushing remembrance that they were no longer free. The first lesson was language. They were forbidden to speak Greek. Any girl caught using her mother tongue was struck across the mouth, not hard enough to leave lasting marks, but hard enough to sting. hard enough to remember. They were taught Turkish through repetition and humiliation. Simple phrases first. Yes, master. No, master. How may I serve you? The words felt like stones in their mouths, heavy and foreign and wrong. Theodora refused to speak for 3 days. She communicated only through gestures and silence, a small rebellion that she thought might preserve something of who she was. On the 4th day, one of the senior attendants, a woman named Safia, who had been taken from Serbia 20 years earlier, pulled her aside into a small courtyard where a fountain bubbled softly against marble. Safia didn't hit her. Instead, she spoke in Greek. The first time, Theodora had heard her own language since arriving at the palace. The words were a shock, almost painful in their familiarity. Listen to me carefully, Safia said, because I will only say this once in a tongue you understand. Your silence will not save you. It will only make what comes next worse. They will break you eventually. Everyone breaks. The only choice you have is whether you break with your mind intact or shattered beyond repair. Theodora stared at this woman who looked Turkish, who dressed Turkish, who served the Sultan with apparent devotion, and saw something in her eyes that made her start speaking Turkish the next day. Not because she had given up, but because she understood that survival required a different kind of resistance, one that looked like surrender but kept something hidden beneath. The language lessons continued every morning for 3 hours. Then came lessons in deportment. How to walk with small steps that made the silk harem pants whisper against the floor. How to lower their eyes in the presence of men. How to serve tea without making a sound. Pouring from height so the liquid made no splash. Presenting the cup with both hands and a slight bow. Every gesture was choreographed. Every movement designed to communicate submission and grace in equal measure. They were taught to apply kohl to their eyes, to redden their lips with pomegranate juice, to oil their skin until it gleamed in lamplight. The girls who'd spent their lives covering their bodies in modest wool now stood half naked before mirrors, learning to see themselves as objects of desire rather than daughters of God. Some of them cried during these lessons. The attendants ignored the tears and continued the instruction, but the worst lessons were the ones that came in the afternoon, in a private chamber where only the selected girls were taken. Here, older women, specialists brought from the inner harem, taught them what the Sultan would expect. They used carved wooden models and explicit language that made the girls cover their faces in shame. There was no room for modesty or innocence here. They were being prepared for a specific function, and ignorance would not be tolerated. These lessons were clinical in their detail and devastating in their implications. The instructors explained anatomy with the detachment of physicians. They demonstrated positions using silk cushions and their own bodies. They described what would be expected, what would please, what would be punished, and throughout it all, they reminded the girls that their value existed only in their ability to satisfy and their continued virginity until the moment they were called to the Sultan's chambers. One girl, Anna from Pera, vomited during the first of these sessions. She was 12 years old and had barely understood what happened between married couples, let alone this. The instructor waited for her to finish, then continued the lesson without pause. Anna learned to hold her stomach, after that, to breathe through her nose and focus on a crack in the ceiling while the instruction continued around her. At night, when the attendants finally left them alone, the girls whispered to each other in the darkness. They tried to comfort each other, to pray together, but even prayer had become dangerous. Crosses had been taken from them. Icons were forbidden. The attendants checked their rooms regularly for any Christian symbols. any attempt to maintain their faith. One girl had scratched a tiny cross into the plaster beside her sleeping mat. When it was discovered, she was taken away. She returned 3 hours later, her hands wrapped in cloth, unable to say what had been done to her. The message was clear. Even your God cannot help you here. Theodora began marking days by scratching tiny lines into the wooden frame of her sleeping platform, hidden underneath where no one would think to look. Each mark was an act of defiance, a way of saying, I still exist, I am still counting, I have not disappeared completely. After 2 weeks, she had 14 marks. After a month, she stopped counting. Time had become meaningless in a place where every day was identical to the last. The palace routine was designed to disorient, to make them forget who they had been. They woke at the same hour, ate the same foods, repeated the same lessons, wore the same silk garments, bathed at the same time in the same scented water. The repetition was hypnotic, lulling them into a kind of waking sleep where resistance seemed pointless and exhausting. Some of the girls adapted faster than others. Maria from Galata began speaking Turkish with an accent that pleased the instructors. She smiled during lessons. She applied her makeup with care and attention. The other girls whispered that she'd forgotten herself, that she'd given up too quickly. But Theodora watched her carefully and saw something else. Maria's eyes remained dead even when she smiled. She was performing survival, playing a role that might keep her alive. Whether she would remember who she was underneath that performance was a different question. Others broke in more obvious ways. Sophia, who had been 15 when she was taken, stopped speaking entirely after the first week. Not in rebellion like Theodora's initial silence, but in complete withdrawal. She completed the lessons mechanically, moving through the motions like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by invisible hands. Her eyes looked through people rather than at them. The attendants noted her condition in their records, but did nothing to address it. A compliant body was all that mattered. The mind was irrelevant. Then there was Eleni, who'd been taken from a convent where she'd been preparing to take her vows. She was 16 and had devoted her entire life to the church. On her 5th night in the palace, after a particularly explicit lesson about what would be expected of her, she tried to end her own life. She used a shard from a broken mirror hidden in the folds of her clothing. She got as far as pressing it against her wrist before another girl screamed and the attendants came running. They saved her life, but not out of compassion. Her value as an unblemished virgin remained intact, and that was all that mattered. She was watched more carefully after that, never left alone, but the instruction continued as if nothing had happened. She attended the lessons with bandaged wrists and empty eyes, and no one spoke of what she had tried to do. The palace physicians examined the girls regularly, checking for illness, for any physical problems that might diminish their value. These examinations were thorough and humiliating, conducted by male doctors who showed no more emotion than if they were inspecting livestock. The girls learned to endure this too, to separate their minds from their bodies, to float somewhere above themselves, while strangers' hands confirmed they remained suitable for imperial use. During one such examination, the physician noted that Theodora had lost weight despite the rich food. He ordered that her portions be increased and that she be given honey water 3 times a day to restore her colour. She was too valuable to waste, he explained to the attendants. Girls of her age and appearance did not come to the palace often. She needed to be preserved in optimal condition. Optimal condition. As if she were a piece of fruit that might spoil. 6 weeks after the fall of Constantinople, the first summons came. Not for Theodora, but for a girl named Irene who slept 3 mats away from her. Irene was 17, with black hair that fell to her waist and eyes that had once been bright with intelligence. The siege had taken that brightness, and the palace had taken everything else. When the attendants came for her at sunset, she didn't resist. She simply stood, allowed them to dress her in white silk embroidered with gold thread, and walked toward the inner chambers with the mechanical grace they had all been taught. The other girls sat in silence after she left. No one spoke. No one dared to acknowledge what they all knew was happening beyond the carved wooden doors that separated their quarters from the Sultan's private rooms. They sat on their cushions and pretended to embroider, their hands moving thread through fabric in patterns they would never remember, anything to keep from thinking about Irene and what she was enduring. She returned 3 hours later. The attendants brought her back and laid her on a sleeping mat without ceremony. Her white silk was stained with blood, not much, but enough to confirm what everyone already knew. She was no longer part of their group. She had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. Her value had been consumed. What remained of her would be relocated to a different part of the harem, among the women who had already served their primary function and now waited to see if they had pleased enough to be remembered or forgotten. Irene didn't speak when she returned. She stared at the ceiling with tears running silently down her temples into her hair, and when Theodora reached out to touch her hand, she flinched as if burned. The next morning she was gone. Her sleeping mat was cleaned and perfumed, ready for the next girl who would need it. The attendants explained the system to them that afternoon. It was quite efficient, they said. The Sultan had many demands on his time, many responsibilities beyond the bedchamber. He could not possibly attend to every girl personally. So there was a rotation, a careful schedule maintained by the mistress of the harem, a woman they had not yet met but whose power over their lives was absolute. Some girls would be chosen for the Sultan himself. Others would be given as gifts to visiting dignitaries, to military commanders, to high-ranking officials who had earned imperial favour. Their virginity was currency, and it would be spent according to the empire's needs. They were told this calmly, as if it were no different from explaining the schedule for meals or lessons. And in a way it wasn't. This had always been their purpose. Everything else, the training, the language lessons, the makeup and deportment, had simply been preparation for this moment when they would fulfill the function for which they had been catalogued and preserved. Theodora felt something inside her break when she understood this. Not shatter violently, but crack slowly, like ice forming across a pond. The fear she'd been carrying since the cistern transformed into something colder and more dangerous. Rage. Pure, helpless rage that had nowhere to go except inward, where it began to burn through everything soft that remained inside her. That night she approached Safiye, the Serbian woman who had spoken to her in Greek weeks earlier. She found her in the bathing rooms, supervising the cleaning of the marble pools. "Teach me," Theodora said in Turkish. "Teach me how to survive this without losing my mind." Safiye looked at her for a long moment, steam from the hot water rising between them like smoke. Then she nodded once and led Theodora to a small storage room where they could speak without being overheard. What she said next Theodora would remember for the rest of her life, however long or short that might be. "You cannot stop what will happen to your body," Safiye began. "That belongs to them now. But your mind, your soul, that can remain yours if you are careful. You must learn to separate. When they touch you, you go somewhere else. You remember a place from before, a garden, a church, anywhere but here. You let your body do what it has been trained to do, and you keep the part of you that matters locked away where they cannot reach it. Can you do that?" Theodora asked. After 20 years, can you still find that place? Safiye's face showed nothing. I am still here, she said. That is all that matters. And then she taught Theodora techniques that had nothing to do with pleasure or submission. She taught her how to breathe through pain, how to make her mind blank, how to comply without surrendering. These were the real lessons of the harem, the ones passed between captives, in whispered conversations, the survival strategies that the official instruction never mentioned. But there was something else Safiye taught her that night, something more dangerous. She taught her about the hidden networks in the palace, the Christian slaves who had converted, but still prayed in secret, the eunuchs who sympathized with the girls' suffering, the merchants who came to deliver goods, and sometimes delivered messages. There were ways, Safiye explained, to get word to the outside world. There were even, very occasionally, ways to escape. Theodora asked why Safiye hadn't escaped, if such pathways existed. Safiye smiled without humour. Because I made the mistake of getting pregnant, she said. I bore the Sultan a son who died in infancy. That connected me to him in a way that cannot be severed. I am watched more carefully than you can imagine. But you are still new, still invisible in the ways that matter. If you are clever, you might find a way out before you become too valuable to lose. The idea planted itself in Theodora's mind like a seed in dark soil. Escape. The word itself felt dangerous to even think, but once she had thought it, she couldn't stop. It grew in her thoughts during the endless lessons, during the humiliating examinations, during the nights when she listened to the other girls crying themselves to sleep. Escape became the thing she focused on, the secret that gave her a reason to wake up each morning. She began to pay attention to details she had previously ignored, the patterns of the guards' rotations, the locations of doors that were sometimes left unlocked, the times when the attendants were distracted by their own duties. She noticed that merchants came to the service entrances every 3 days to deliver food and fabric. She noticed that some of the eunuchs who guarded the harem were Greek converts who still crossed themselves when they thought no one was watching. And she noticed something else. The girls who caught the Sultan's attention more than once, who pleased him enough to be summoned repeatedly, were given small privileges, better quarters, more freedom to move through certain areas of the palace, less constant supervision. It was a trap, of course, designed to encourage compliance and competition among the captives. But Theodora began to wonder if it might also be an opportunity. The thought made her sick. The idea of submitting willingly, of trying to please the man who had destroyed her city and stolen her life, felt like the ultimate betrayal of everything she had been. But what was she now? What had she become in these weeks of training and transformation? She barely recognized herself in the polished bronze mirrors. The girl in the reflection wore silk and kohl and spoke Turkish with increasing fluency. The girl in the reflection had learned to walk and serve and smile on command. Maybe, Theodora thought, that girl could do what was necessary to survive. Maybe that girl could play the game well enough to win the small freedoms that might lead to larger ones. Maybe that girl could smile and submit and please, all while keeping the rage locked safely inside where it could be preserved and protected until the moment it was needed. It was Safiye who confirmed the possibility. The Sultan likes intelligence, she told Theodora during another secret conversation. Not defiance, but cleverness. He likes girls who can speak properly, who understand poetry and music. He gets bored with the ones who simply lie there and weep. If you can make yourself interesting to him, you might survive long enough to find your way out. So Theodora began a different kind of preparation. She paid attention during the poetry lessons, memorizing verses in Turkish and Persian. She learned to play the oud, a stringed instrument that reminded her painfully of the lyre her father had once owned. She studied the other girls who had been summoned and returned, noting what they said about their experiences, what had been expected of them, what had pleased and what had disappointed. She was doing exactly what the palace wanted her to do, becoming the perfect concubine. But she told herself it was strategy, not surrender. A means to an end, a way to gain the access and freedom she would need to escape. Whether that was true or whether she was simply finding a way to rationalize her own capitulation, she couldn't be certain. The line between strategy and submission had become impossibly thin. 2 months after arriving at the palace, Theodora was summoned. The attendants came for her in the evening, as they had for Irene, as they had for dozens of other girls. They bathed her in rosewater and dressed her in crimson silk. They painted her eyes and oiled her skin and placed a thin gold chain around her ankle. They told her to remember everything she had been taught. They told her that her life depended on pleasing the Sultan. They told her that fear was natural, but resistance was suicide. Then they led her through corridors she had never seen, past rooms filled with treasures looted from the conquered city, past guards who stared straight ahead as if she were invisible, toward the chambers where the Sultan waited. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack them. Her hands shook despite her efforts to control them. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to refuse this final violation. But she remembered Safia's words. She remembered the breathing techniques. She remembered that her body was already lost, but her mind could remain her own. She remembered that survival required strategies that looked like surrender. She walked forward with small, graceful steps, her eyes lowered, her face a mask of calm she did not feel. The Sultan's private chamber was not what she expected. There were no instruments of torture, no obvious signs of violence. Instead, the room was beautiful, in a way that made the horror worse. Silk carpets layered 3 deep across marble floors. Oil lamps cast golden light across walls, painted with intricate geometric patterns. Cushions embroidered with silver thread surrounded a low table set with wine and fruit. Incense burned in copper braziers, filling the air with sandalwood and amber. It looked like paradise, and that made it the most terrifying place Theodora had ever been. Sultan Mehmed II sat on a raised divan, watching her enter. He was 31 years old, younger than she had imagined, with a sharp face and eyes that missed nothing. He didn't smile when he saw her. He simply studied her the way a scholar might study a manuscript, looking for something specific in the details. She kept her eyes down as she had been trained, but she could feel the weight of his gaze moving across her face, her body, assessing what he had been brought. He spoke to her in Turkish, his voice conversational, almost casual. "What is your name?" The attendants had given her a new name when she arrived, Gulbahar, meaning rose of spring. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was different. "Theodora," she said. "My name is Theodora." The room went silent. The eunuch, who had escorted her, stiffened in the doorway. She had just made her first mistake, admitting to an identity that was supposed to have been erased. For a moment she thought she might be dragged away before anything else could happen, punished for this small act of defiance. But the Sultan laughed. Not cruelly, but with what seemed like genuine amusement. "Theodora," he repeated. "A Byzantine name. You insist on remembering what you were." "I remember what I am," she said, and immediately regretted it. The training had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of response. She was supposed to be compliant, agreeable, invisible in every way, except physical. But something in her refused to disappear completely, even here, even now." The Sultan gestured for the eunuch to leave. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a cell locking. They were alone. Mehmed rose from the divan and walked toward her slowly, circling her the way a buyer might circle a horse at market. She forced herself to remain still, to keep breathing, to stay present in her body, even as every instinct told her to flee somewhere deep inside herself. "Do you know why you are here?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "Say it." Her throat closed. The words felt impossible to speak aloud, to give voice to what she was being forced to become, but she understood that silence now would be worse than compliance. "To serve you," she said. The words tasted like ashes. He stopped circling and stood in front of her, close enough that she could smell the rosewater on his skin, the wine on his breath. He reached out and lifted her chin with one finger, forcing her to meet his eyes. What she saw there was worse than cruelty. It was curiosity. He was interested in her, not as a person, but as a puzzle. She was the daughter of the empire he had just conquered, and he wanted to understand what he had won. "Your city fell because it was weak," he said, "because your emperors were fools who prayed instead of preparing. Your God could not save you because your God does not exist. Only power exists. Do you understand this?" Every lesson, every instruction from the attendants had taught her to agree with whatever he said. But Theodora found herself shaking her head, a tiny movement, barely perceptible. "No," she said. "I don't understand that." She waited for his hand to strike her face, for him to call the guards, for the punishment that would surely come from contradiction. But instead he smiled, not warmly, but with the satisfaction of someone who had just confirmed a hypothesis. "Good," he said. "I despise girls who agree with everything I say. They bore me within minutes." He returned to the divan and gestured for her to sit across from him. She lowered herself onto the cushions, every muscle tense, waiting for the moment when conversation would end and the real purpose of this summons would begin. But he simply poured wine into 2 golden cups and handed her one. "Drink," he commanded. "You look like you are about to shatter." She took the cup with trembling hands and sipped. The wine was sweeter than anything she had tasted, heavy with spices she couldn't name. It burned down her throat and pooled warm in her empty stomach. He watched her drink, then began to speak. Not about what he intended to do to her, but about Constantinople, about the siege, about his frustration with the final days when Byzantine defenders had fought with a desperation that had cost him more men than he had anticipated. He talked about the city as if it were a woman he had pursued and finally claimed. He described breaching the walls in language that made her skin crawl, violent and possessive and triumphant. He spoke about standing in the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, and ordering it converted to a mosque. The symbolism of that transformation pleased him more than the military victory itself. It proved, he said, that even holiness could be conquered and repurposed. "And now I have you," he continued, "daughters of Byzantium, sitting in my palace, wearing my silk, speaking my language. You are the final proof of conquest. Not the walls I destroyed, but the lives I have reshaped." Theodora felt the rage that had been building inside her since the cistern rise like bile. "You have our bodies," she heard herself say. "You do not have us." The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and irretrievable. She had just said the one thing the training had been designed to prevent. She had claimed an identity separate from his ownership. She had drawn a line that should not have been drawn. Mehmed's expression did not change. He simply looked at her for a long moment, then set down his wine cup. "We will see," he said quietly. He stood and moved toward her. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the moment all the training had prepared her for. She remembered Safier's instructions: go somewhere else. Let your body do what it has been trained to do. Keep your soul locked away where he cannot reach it. She closed her eyes and tried to find that internal space, that garden or church or anywhere but here. But then he did something unexpected. He sat beside her, close but not touching, and began to speak in Greek, perfect, unaccented Greek that shocked her into opening her eyes. Do you think I do not understand you? He asked in her own language. Do you think I conquered your empire without learning everything about it? I have read your philosophers. I have studied your history. I probably know your God better than you do. The revelation was devastating. She had thought language might be a small space of privacy, a place where her thoughts could remain her own. But even that had been an illusion. He had access to everything, even the words she whispered to herself in the dark. I want to show you something, he said, switching back to Turkish. He rose and walked to a carved wooden chest in the corner of the chamber. From it, he withdrew a book, an illuminated manuscript bound in leather. He returned to the cushions and opened it across his lap. The pages were filled with Greek text and illustrations in gold leaf and brilliant colours. It was a gospel book stolen from some church during the conquest. Beautiful, is it not? He said. Your civilization created extraordinary things. Art, philosophy, architecture that will outlast empires. I do not destroy beauty, Theodora. I collect it. I preserve it. I give it new purpose within my empire. He turned pages slowly, showing her images of Christ and the apostles rendered by some Byzantine master whose name was lost to history. You think I am a barbarian who burns books and kills scholars. But I am a student of your culture. I simply refuse to be limited by it. I take what is valuable and discard what is weak. And which am I? Theodora asked. Valuable or weak? He closed the book and set it aside. That depends entirely on you. What followed was not the violent assault she had been prepared for. Instead, Mehmed talked. He asked her questions about her life before the siege, what her father had done, what she had believed about the world, what she had been taught about the Ottomans. He listened to her answers with genuine attention, occasionally challenging her assumptions, sometimes agreeing with criticisms of Byzantine corruption and weakness. It was a seduction more insidious than physical force. He was treating her like a person whose thoughts mattered, whose perspective was interesting. After weeks of being treated as livestock, as an object to be prepared and presented, this sudden recognition of her humanity was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She found herself talking more than she intended, sharing memories and opinions she had planned to keep locked away. Hours passed, the oil lamps burned lower, more wine was poured, and slowly, carefully, he moved closer. His hand brushed her arm, ostensibly to emphasize a point in conversation. His knee touched hers as he leaned forward to refill her cup. Each touch was calculated, designed to seem incidental, to lower her defences incrementally, rather than shatter them all at once. When he finally kissed her, it was gentle, almost questioning, nothing like the brutal assault she had steeled herself against. And that gentleness was the cruelest thing he could have done, because it created confusion where there should have been only clarity. She should have been able to hate this purely, to maintain the rage that had sustained her. But his approach made everything complicated, blurred the lines between violation and something that might almost look like choice. She let him continue, not because the training had worked, but because she remembered why she was here. She remembered Safier's words about survival requiring strategies that looked like surrender. She remembered that pleasing him might grant her the privileges that could lead to escape. She told herself she was enduring this for a purpose, that her compliance was tactical rather than true submission. But when he laid her back against the silk cushions and began to remove her clothing, when his hands moved across skin that no one had ever touched, she felt something inside her fracture in a way that Safia's breathing techniques could not prevent. She went somewhere else in her mind, tried to remember the garden behind her house where roses grew against a southern wall. But even there in that imagined sanctuary, she could feel what was happening to her body. The separation was not complete. The pain, when it came, dragged her back into the present, into the reality of what she was losing. When it was over, Mehmed didn't dismiss her immediately as she had expected. He lay beside her in the lamplight, one hand tracing idle patterns across her shoulder, and continued talking as if nothing significant had happened. He spoke about his plans for the city, about the mosques he would build, the libraries he would establish, the scholars he would invite from across the Islamic world. Constantinople would become the greatest city on earth, he said, greater than it had been under the Byzantines, a bridge between civilizations, a capital worthy of empire. Theodora lay silent, feeling blood on the silk beneath her, feeling the throbbing pain between her legs that the attendants had warned her about, but which was somehow worse than any warning could convey. She felt hollowed out, erased, as if the person she had been that morning no longer existed. But she forced herself to listen to his words, to file them away, to keep her mind active even as her body trembled with shock and pain. "You are thinking," he said suddenly, turning to look at her. "I can see it in your eyes. You are not simply enduring, you are calculating." This pleased him, she realized. Her survival instincts, her refusal to completely disappear, entertained him in a way that simple submission would not have. It made her more valuable, which meant it made her more trapped. He called for attendants then, and they appeared immediately, as if they had been waiting just beyond the door. They helped Theodora to stand, supported her when her legs threatened to give way, wrapped her in a silk robe that covered the evidence of what had happened. Mehmed gave them instructions in a language she did not recognize, and they bowed deeply before leading her away. But instead of returning her to the common quarters where she had spent the last 2 months, they took her to a different part of the harem. These rooms were larger, more luxurious, with windows that actually opened to let in air and light. There was a proper bed instead of a sleeping mat, a bronze mirror, a chest for clothing. It was a gilded cage, but the bars were wider than before. The senior attendant, a woman who had not spoken to Theodora before, explained the new arrangements. She had pleased the Sultan. She would be called upon again. In the meantime, she would receive better accommodations, better food, more freedom to move through certain areas of the palace. She was no longer in training. She was now part of the active harem, with a status above the unconsumed girls, but below the true favourites who had borne imperial children. Theodora listened to this explanation through a fog of pain and exhaustion. When the attendants finally left her alone, she collapsed onto the bed and let herself feel everything she had been holding back. The tears came in waves, silent and endless, soaking the silk pillows. She cried for what had been taken from her, for the girl she had been, for her family, who she would never see again, for the city that had fallen, for every degradation she had endured and would continue to endure. But beneath the grief something else stirred. The rage had not disappeared. If anything, it had intensified, sharpened by violation into something harder and more dangerous. Mehmed thought he had conquered her, thought his combination of brutality and gentleness had achieved submission. But he had miscalculated. He had given her motivation stronger than any she had possessed before. He had made escape not just a possibility but a necessity. Over the following weeks, Theodora discovered that her new status came with unexpected opportunities. She was allowed to walk in certain palace gardens under supervision. She was permitted to attend poetry readings and musical performances in the harem's common areas. She saw parts of the palace complex that had been invisible to her before, and with each new space, she mentally mapped routes, noted guard positions, identified potential weaknesses in the security that kept hundreds of women imprisoned. She was summoned to the Sultan's chambers 3 more times that month. Each time, she employed the strategy that had worked initially. She engaged his mind while surrendering her body. She asked intelligent questions about his plans for the empire. She recited poetry in Greek and Turkish. She played the oud with increasing skill. She made herself interesting, valuable in ways beyond the physical, and each time he seemed more pleased with her than the last. The other women in the harem noticed her rising status with a mixture of envy and calculation. Some avoided her, seeing her as competition for the Sultan's limited attention. Others sought her friendship, hoping her favour might extend to them. Theodora accepted neither rejection nor alliance with equal indifference. She was focused on a single goal, and relationships within the harem were merely tools toward that end. It was during one of the poetry readings that she encountered someone unexpected. Among the musicians brought to entertain the harem was a young man, barely more than a boy, who played the ney flute with heartbreaking skill. He kept his eyes down as required, but when he played, Theodora heard something in the music that made her look at him more carefully. There was grief in those notes, a sorrow that spoke of loss she recognised. After the performance, she managed to position herself near the exit as the musicians were being escorted out. As he passed, she whispered a single word in Greek: "Brother." The boy's step faltered almost imperceptibly, but he did not turn. He simply continued walking, his face showing nothing. But Theodora had seen the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had tightened on his instrument. He had understood. She learned his name through careful questions to the attendants who did not think such information mattered. Alexios. He was a palace musician, one of many taken during the conquest and trained for imperial service. He performed regularly in various parts of the palace complex, and he was Greek. It took weeks to arrange another moment of contact. Theodora volunteered to serve during gatherings where musicians performed, a task usually beneath someone of her status, but which the attendants allowed because they thought she was simply trying to please the Sultan by developing cultural refinement. During one such event, she managed to pass near Alexios as he packed his instruments. She dropped a silk handkerchief, and when he bent to retrieve it, she whispered quickly in Greek, "I need to send a message outside. Can you help me?" His face remained impassive as he handed back the handkerchief, but his response was barely audible. "Yes. Next week, same room. Bring what you need written." That night, Theodora composed a letter in her mind. She had no paper, no ink, nothing that could be found if her room was searched. So she memorized every word, refining the message until it was as concise as possible, while still conveying what needed to be said. She addressed it to her uncle, a merchant who had escaped the city before the final siege. If he was still alive, if the message reached him, he might be able to help. It was a desperate hope, but it was hope nonetheless. The following week, during another musical performance, Theodora approached Alexios with a request that seemed innocent to any observer. She asked him to teach her a particular song, claiming the Sultan had expressed interest in hearing it. The attendants approved this cultural exchange, seeing it as evidence of her dedication to pleasing their master. They allowed her a supervised lesson in a small practice room, with an elderly eunuch sitting in the corner to ensure propriety. But the eunuch was half deaf and more interested in his own drowsiness than their conversation. Theodora sang the melody while Alexios played, and between verses, in rushed whispers, she recited the letter she had memorized. Alexios's fingers never faltered on the flute, but she saw his eyes darken as he absorbed her words. When the lesson ended, he bowed formally and said in Turkish, loud enough for the eunuch to hear, that she had learned well and should practice daily. Under his breath in Greek, he added, 2 weeks. I will try. Those 2 weeks were the longest of Theodora's life. She was summoned to Mehmed twice more, and each time she had to suppress the knowledge of what she had set in motion, had to perform the role of willing concubine, while her mind raced through possibilities and dangers. If the message was discovered, if Alexios was caught, if her uncle could not or would not help, she would lose everything. The small privileges she had gained would evaporate. Her fate would be worse than the common concubines who simply disappeared into the harem's depths. But she had committed to this path, and retreat was impossible. She refined her plans, studied the palace routines with even greater attention, cultivated relationships with servants who might prove useful. She learned which guards accepted bribes, which eunuchs felt sympathy for the captive women, which merchants came and went through the service entrances with minimal supervision. Every piece of information was a potential tool. Then one evening during her bath, an attendant she barely knew pressed something small and hard into her palm beneath the scented water. Theodora's fingers closed around it reflexively. The attendant leaned close, ostensibly to pour water over her shoulders, and whispered, "From the flute player, burn it after reading." When Theodora was finally alone, she unfolded the tiny scrap of paper that had been compressed into a pellet. The writing was so small she had to hold it close to the lamp to read. The message was brief. "Your uncle lives. He has been contacted. He is arranging something. Be ready. Trust no one." She held the paper in the lamp flame and watched it curl into ash. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming rush of possibility. Someone outside these walls knew she existed. Someone was trying to help. The cage door had not opened, but she could hear someone working on the lock. That night, for the first time since her capture, Theodora allowed herself to imagine a future beyond these walls. She saw herself walking through streets not as a prisoner, but as a free woman. She saw herself speaking her own name without permission. She saw herself choosing where to go, what to do, who to become. The images were painful in their intensity, dangerous in their power to make her current reality even more unbearable. But they also gave her something she had been lacking. Not just hope, but purpose beyond mere survival. She was not simply enduring until death or complete erasure. She was actively working toward liberation, and that shifted everything. 3 weeks after receiving the message, Theodora was summoned to the Sultan's chambers at an unusual hour, well past midnight. She had learned to read the subtle signals of these summons. The tone in the attendant's voice, the urgency or casualness of the preparation. This time something felt different. The attendants dressed her quickly, without the usual meticulous attention to detail. They seemed nervous, glancing at each other with expressions she could not quite interpret. When she entered Mehmed's chambers, she found him standing at the window, overlooking the darkened city, his back to her. He did not turn when she entered, did not acknowledge her presence in the usual way. She stood in silence, waiting, her heart beginning to race with an anxiety she could not name. Finally he spoke without turning around. "I have received troubling information," he said. His voice was calm, which somehow made the words more frightening. There are rumours of messages being passed between my harem and the outside world. Communication that has not been authorised. Theodora's blood turned to ice. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had Alexios been caught? Had the message been intercepted? Had someone betrayed her? She forced her face to remain neutral, her breathing steady, even as terror clawed at her chest. "I know nothing of such things, my lord," she said quietly. "Of course you do not," he replied, and there was something in his tone that she could not decipher. "You are too intelligent to involve yourself in something so foolish, too aware of what the consequences would be." He turned to face her then, and she saw something in his expression that chilled her more than anger would have. Disappointment. As if he had expected better from her, as if she had failed some test she had not known she was taking. He crossed the room slowly, studying her face with that same careful attention he had shown during their first meeting. She held his gaze, knowing that looking away would be an admission of guilt. "Do you know what happens to women who betray my trust?" he asked softly. She did know. Everyone in the harem knew. There were stories whispered in the dark about girls who had displeased the sultan, who had tried to escape or communicate with the outside world. They were sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. Their bodies were never recovered. They simply disappeared, and their names were struck from every record as if they had never existed. "I would never betray you, my lord," Theodora said, and the lie tasted like poison on her tongue. "Everything you have given me, every kindness, I am grateful for it all." He smiled at that, but it did not reach his eyes. "Kindness," he repeated. "Is that what you call it? Interesting choice of words." He circled around behind her, and every instinct screamed at her to turn, to keep him in her sight. But she forced herself to remain still. His hand touched her shoulder, gentle as always, and slid down to her wrist. He lifted her arm, examining it as if looking for something. "I have been generous with you, Theodora. More generous than you perhaps realise. Other men would have broken you in the first hour and discarded what remained. I chose a different path. I thought you might be worth preserving. Worth cultivating. I am honoured by your attention," she whispered, hating every word. "Are you?" His hand tightened on her wrist, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind her how easily he could. "Because I wonder sometimes if you mistake my gentleness for weakness. If you believe that because I speak to you as if you are human, you actually are. But you are not human here, Theodora. You are property. Beautiful, valuable property, but property nonetheless." He released her wrist and moved back to stand in front of her. "The musician who's been teaching you songs," he said, changing the subject so abruptly that she felt dizzy. "What is his name?" Her throat closed. This was it. They knew. Someone had talked or been caught or made a mistake, and now everything was about to collapse. "Alexios," she managed to say. "I do not know. His family name, my lord." "Alexios," Mehmed repeated. "A Greek name? A Christian name? Tell me, Theodora, when he teaches you these songs, does he ever speak of anything else? Does he ever say things that might seem unusual?" She understood the trap immediately. If she claimed complete ignorance, it would seem suspicious. If she admitted to any conversation, it could be twisted into evidence of conspiracy. She chose the middle path, the one that might sound most truthful. "We speak only of music, my lord. He is very focused on his craft. Sometimes he mentions technical matters, the history of certain melodies, but nothing beyond that." "Nothing beyond that," Mehmed echoed. How disappointing. I had hoped he might be more interesting. He turned away from her again, and she felt the interrogation shift in some way she could not quite grasp. "You may go," he said abruptly. I find I am not in the mood for company tonight after all." The dismissal was so unexpected that she stood frozen for a moment, unsure if she had heard correctly. When he did not turn back to look at her, she bowed deeply and backed toward the door, her mind reeling. Was this a test? A game? Had he been trying to frighten her into confession? Or did he genuinely not know anything specific? She could not tell, and that uncertainty was its own form of torture. The attendants who had brought her were waiting outside, and their faces confirmed that something unusual had happened. They escorted her back to her chambers in silence, their expressions carefully neutral. When they left her alone, Theodora collapsed against the door, her entire body shaking with the terror she had been suppressing. That had been too close. Whatever Mehmed knew or suspected, he was watching her now with increased attention. Any further attempts to communicate with the outside world would have to be impossibly careful or impossibly bold. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her bed watching the sky slowly lighten through the window, turning over every word of the conversation, analysing every inflection and pause. By morning she had reached a conclusion. Mehmed knew something, but not everything. He was probing, testing, trying to provoke a reaction that would confirm his suspicions, and she had given him nothing definitive. But that also meant Alexios was in danger. If Mehmed was asking about him specifically, the musician was being watched or had already been questioned. Any further contact would put them both at risk. Theodora's carefully constructed plan was crumbling before it had a chance to succeed. 2 days later, during the midday meal, in the harem's common area, word spread through the women like fire through dry grass. A musician had been arrested, a Greek boy who had been caught with messages intended for outside the palace. He was being interrogated in the dungeons beneath the administrative complex. Everyone knew what interrogation meant. Everyone knew that very few people emerged from those dungeons whole if they emerged at all. Theodora forced herself to eat, to show no reaction, to continue her routine, as if this news meant nothing to her. But inside she was screaming. Alexios had been caught. Her message, her desperate attempt at freedom had destroyed him. And she knew with sick certainty that if he broke under torture, if he revealed her involvement, she would be next. The waiting was agony. Hours stretched into days with no further word. Theodora was not summoned to Mehmed's chambers again, which might mean he was waiting for information from the interrogation, or might mean he had already decided her fate. She moved through the palace in a fog of dread, expecting at any moment to feel the guard's hands on her shoulders, to be dragged down to those same dungeons where Alexios was suffering. On the 5th day, a body was displayed in the palace's outer courtyard. Theodora did not see it herself, but the description passed through the harem with horrified whispers. A young man, barely recognizable after the interrogation, hung from the walls as a warning to anyone who might consider betraying the Sultan's trust. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who forget their place. That night, Theodora cried for Alexios, not openly, not where anyone could see or hear, but silently into her pillow until she had no tears left. She'd killed him. Her desire for freedom, her inability to accept her fate, had cost this boy his life. The guilt was crushing, suffocating, worse than any physical pain she had endured. But beneath the guilt, cold and hard as stone, a new determination formed. Alexios had died trying to help her. His sacrifice could not be meaningless. She could not give up now, could not resign herself to permanent captivity, because that would make his death worthless. She owed him more than that. She owed him her continued resistance, her refusal to be completely conquered, her determination to escape or die trying. The plan would have to change. Direct communication with the outside world was now impossible. But there were other ways, slower, more dangerous ways. Theodora began to cultivate a different kind of relationship with the palace servants. Not asking for help, but simply being kind, remembering their names, noticing when they were tired or sad or troubled. Small gestures that cost her nothing, but built a currency of goodwill that might someday be valuable. She also began to study the palace's physical structure with new intensity. During her supervised walks in the gardens, she noted which walls were lowest, which gates were least guarded, which times of day saw the fewest servants and soldiers. She memorized patrol patterns, shift changes, the rhythms of palace life that might reveal vulnerabilities. If she could not communicate her way to freedom, perhaps she could find a physical path. Months passed in this careful observation and preparation. Theodora was summoned to Mehmed's chambers regularly, and each time she performed her role with increasing skill. She had become what they wanted her to become, a perfect concubine who anticipated his desires, who could discuss poetry and philosophy while submitting to his physical demands. She hated every moment, but she also recognized that this performance was her armor, the thing that kept her valuable enough to preserve. Then, 9 months after the fall of Constantinople, something changed. Theodora's monthly bleeding, which had continued with regularity despite everything, stopped. At first, she thought it was stress or poor health or simply the body's response to trauma. But when it did not return after 2 months, the palace physicians were called to examine her. Their verdict was delivered to the mistress of the harem before it was delivered to Theodora herself. She was carrying the Sultan's child. The news spread through the harem like a shockwave. Everything about Theodora's status changed overnight. She was moved to even more luxurious quarters in a section of the palace reserved for pregnant concubines. Her every need was attended to by a dedicated staff of servants and physicians. Her meals were carefully prepared to ensure the health of the child. She was wrapped in privilege and protection that felt like the tightest imprisonment she had yet experienced. Because now she was not just valuable, she was irreplaceable. If she bore the Sultan a healthy child, especially a son, her position in the harem would be secured for life. She would become a mother in the imperial household, with power and influence she could never achieve otherwise. The other concubines looked at her with envy and calculation, knowing that her body now carried something that could elevate her above them all. But Theodora felt none of the joy or security that everyone assumed she should feel. Instead, she felt trapped in a way that made all previous captivity seem almost bearable. There was a life growing inside her, half her and half the man who had destroyed everything she loved. A child who would be raised Ottoman, who would never know the city of its mother's birth, who would be taught to worship the empire that had enslaved its mother. She placed her hand on her still flat stomach and felt something break inside her that had somehow remained intact through everything else. This was the final conquest, not of her body or her freedom, but of her future. Any child she bore would belong to the empire, would be a tool of the power that had stolen her life, and she would have to love it because it would be hers, even as she hated everything it represented. That night, alone in her new chambers, with guards stationed outside her door for protection, Theodora made a decision that terrified her even as she committed to it. She could not escape now. Her pregnancy made that impossible. She was watched too carefully, valued too highly, imprisoned too completely. But a child once born and weaned, once established as part of the imperial household, that child might have opportunities its mother never would. If she could not free herself, perhaps she could free her child. Perhaps she could raise it with enough knowledge of who she had been, enough understanding of the world beyond these walls that someday it might choose differently. It was a desperate hope, years in the future, dependent on countless variables she could not control. But it was the only hope she had left. And so Theodora of Constantinople, daughter of a conquered city, mother to the conqueror's child, settled into her gilded cage and began to plan not for her own escape, but for a freedom she would never live to see. She placed her hand on her stomach again and whispered in Greek, so softly that no one could hear. "I will tell you who we were. Even if they take everything else, I will give you that." Outside her window, the city that had been Byzantium sprawled beneath Ottoman minarets, its identity transformed, its history being rewritten, its daughters locked away in palaces, where their stories would be buried beneath official records and deliberate silence. But in this room, in this moment, one of those daughters refused to disappear completely. She would survive, she would remember, and she would pass that memory forward, a small act of defiance that might echo longer than empires. If you have stayed with this story until now, if you have felt what Theodora felt, if you have understood the horror that official histories try to smooth over with diplomatic language, then leave a comment. Tell us what this story made you feel. Tell us if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, even centuries later. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that refuse to let the forgotten stay buried, then subscribe. Because there are thousands of Theodoras in the archives, thousands of voices waiting to be given words again. And we will keep speaking for them, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. Some stories demand to be told. This is one of them.